Welcome, everybody. I'm Larry Lehman. I'm a physician here in the Department of Family Medicine and do addiction medicine. Um, we're just totally excited that we have the opportunity to bring Dr. Peter Hendricks here to do this talk. As I think hopefully people know that we have a growing program here of doing research in addiction and substance use disorders. Part of that includes developing research in the area of psychedelic therapies for trauma and addiction. We now have an MDMA study starting, ketamine one on board, and likely early next year psilocybin. So we're very interested in the idea of using these innovative treatments for trauma and addiction. When we heard we could have someone come and talk about this, Dr. Peter Hendricks was my first choice of who could come here and do that. He's based in the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and Birmingham is the premier campus of the University of Alabama, is what I've been told. And he's there. He's been doing research there for about 14 years, looking at the use of psilocybin. He's been looking at psilocybin with cocaine use disorder, to
Is the audience here, are we graduate students or undergraduates? Maybe just a show of hands, how many are undergraduate students? So that's what I was saying, everyone looks younger. Okay, how many are graduate students then? Many, and some are residents or like trainees later in their career. Okay, and some are faculty, I know. Okay. And I'm also curious, this question is important because years ago, when I talk about psychedelics, I realized that the audience would not have heard much, and most would have assumed I'd lost my mind. And so I had to make my case. And I had to introduce the audience to some basic concepts. But with the passing years, I found the audiences are very well informed and sophisticated. And so sometimes I go over information they've already heard, but I'm curious how many of you are well versed in psychedelics or have heard of them before. Almost everybody. How many of you don't know much at all? It's okay. Okay, good. That's good. Okay. Well, I'm really happy again to be talking about this. When I started doing this work years ago, I thought it would likely be my first and only study on psychedelics, and that it essentially be my exit from academia. And I started this line of work in part because I was just very bored with what I was doing. And with all apologies to my graduate mentor, most of that work focused on self-help booklets for smoking cessation, which was just painful for me. There's a place for it, obviously, but it's not what I wanted to be doing. And so I think psychedelic research was the antidote for me to do something that really seemed exciting and cutting edge. And also, when you work in the addiction world, you come to learn, unfortunately, that most of our treatments just don't work very well. And I was really eager to find something that might actually make the difference in the lives of the people who I was working with, because there really is so little, and it can lead to a sense of demoralization on their part and on the part of the clinician. So let me just mention some advisory relationships here I'm in. This is new to me. I will say, if we wanted to discuss this during the Q&A portion, I have come to appreciate that there is the need to commercialize these drugs if we want them to be available to a wide audience. I did want to mention that very recently my colleague Chuck Nichols and I took on the role of co-editors-in-chief of Psychedelic Medicine. This is a peer-reviewed journal published by Mary Liebert Publications. Check it out. It's really fun and exciting. It's the first journal that specifically focuses on psychedelics, which we define as serotonin 2A agonists primarily. So we're focusing on psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, DMT, but we also accept submissions around ketamine and MDMA. We're not that rigid, but it's really exciting that there is also a journal dedicated to this topic. Again, when I thought this will have me ushered from academia altogether. So psychedelics or classic psychedelics, as I mentioned, these are serotonin 2A agonists. That's where their primary mechanism of action lies. They appear to be widespread in nature and have been used across history in a number of typically very highly ritualized contexts, and they seem to have been used for the most part to promote healing or divine the future, enhance learning, or facilitate the dying process. Not always. There is a dark side to psychedelics, which I'll mention in just a bit. But there are some bits of anthropological evidence that would suggest that humans have used mushrooms for many thousands of years. And on the left is a reproduction of a cave drawing from modern day Algeria. And this is a humanoid with mushrooms growing from its body, and it seems to have mushrooms for hands. And this was found in what appears to be some sort of sacramental site that archaeologists believe was used for mushroom ceremonies. So mushrooms or psilocybin could be the oldest known psychoactive drug that humans have used. The interesting thing is the Western world largely forgot all about psychedelics, or at least psilocybin, until the man you see there on the right, R. Gordon Wasson, made contact with Maria Sabina, who I think is an unsung hero and someone we should talk more about. But R. Gordon Wasson had this sense that there were indeed psychoactive mushrooms still in use by indigenous peoples in modern day Mexico. And he was a banker. He was an amateur mycologist. He just had a hunch and started to spend some time asking around. And after some time, he eventually met Maria Sabina, who was in a rather remote part of Mexico, and she allowed him to participate in a mushroom ceremony. Although she was very hesitant to do so, she did ask him not to reveal her name or location. And he promised that he wouldn't do so, but almost immediately did, both in Life magazine and in a book that he wrote with his wife. And she regretted this then for the rest of her life, because her village then had to deal with a sort of onslaught of hippies. And the relationship with the local police was already fraught. This was an indigenous community, and Maria did not speak Spanish, and it seemed to make the relationship with the local law enforcement even more fraught. So she is an important figure. We wouldn't know about psilocybin the way we know about it today without her. And yet I think she really was unfortunately exploited by R. Gordon Wasson and doesn't get enough credit. So thank you, Maria Sabina, I'll say before moving forward. When R. Gordon Wasson discussed his discovery, it was discussed in Life magazine, and it led to the beginning in a new area of research and what we might think of as the first wave of psychedelic research. Before I talk about that, one question is, like, why does psilocybin exist? What is its purpose? What does it do? And I, in some ways, like to demystify psilocybin in a way, if I could. Psilocybin, like many psychoactive drugs, seems to serve as a pesticide, and it's specifically a gastropod antifeedant, which means it prevents slugs and snails from eating the mushroom. The mushroom, unlike, say, like a fruiting body of a tree, like an apple, from an evolutionary perspective, doesn't really want to be eaten. That's not advantageous. So it produces psilocybin to prevent slugs and snails from eating it. That way it can drop its spores and create more mushrooms or more fungi. And so something to keep in mind as we move through this, it's a gastropod antifeedant, and it just so happens to have the effects it does in the human nervous system, which is fascinating to me. So psilocybin was discovered. There was some research with psilocybin until LSD was discovered. And LSD was discovered rather by happenstance by Albert Hofmann, that gentleman there on the left. He was working with the ergot fungus and felt that some components of the ergot fungus might be useful for some circulation problems that some women might have after giving birth. And he stumbled upon LSD when he accidentally ingested it, had a pretty wild experience, as you might imagine, and decided, as any rational person would, that he would reproduce that experience the next day intentionally. And that day is now known as Bicycle Day. because he ingested LSD at the office until he felt a bit overwhelmed and then hopped on his bicycle and went home. He rode his bicycle because it was World War II and there was some moratorium on automobile use. So Albert Hofmann came across LSD, and the laboratories company he'd been working with, Sandoz Laboratories, had this idea that LSD could be useful for psychological or psychiatric applications. And at the time, you could have your chemist, in this case Hofmann, ingest the substance himself and say, hey, here's where I think this drug could be useful. And the company would in turn send communication to clinicians and researchers and say, we've got a drug which we think you might be interested in. And our insight around where it might be useful is based on an N of one, Albert Hofmann, who synthesized it and used it himself. And so a number of people began to experiment with LSD, and there was clearly a lot of enthusiasm because it is extraordinarily potent, and its effects are unlike really any other psychoactive drug that exists. And I think it also helped that the experiences were in many ways consistent with psychoanalytic or psychodynamic models that were very popular at the time. There was this idea that you could access unconscious areas of your mind, thoughts that you would not otherwise have access to. Now, as I said, there was a dark side to LSD. The CIA thought that LSD could be useful as a mind control drug, that they might be able to create the Manchurian Candidate. There's a great book here on the right, Acid Dreams, that goes into depth about everything the CIA did. And there's more to it than that. And some recent publications have even suggested that Charlie Manson, the cult leader, if you saw Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he would have been depicted in that movie. There was some sense that Charlie Manson may have been a CIA asset, and he was quite fond of LSD and appeared to have used it maybe to control his followers to some degree. And there's a long and complicated history around the CIA administering psychedelics to American citizens without their consent or knowledge, because they thought it could be weaponized. And related to that, though, I did mention that across history, psychedelics have typically been used in a healing context. There is documented evidence of them also being used to facilitate warfare, to prepare warriors for battle, and sometimes to even facilitate human sacrifice. So they have not always been good. And I'm often fond of saying that psilocybin or psychedelics, like any drug, is really neither good nor bad, in the same way that television is really neither good nor bad. It really depends how it's used. Now, in the middle, I want to point out the man on the left who is dressed as a police officer. His name is Al Hubbard. And Al Hubbard came into contact with LSD because he was essentially working with the precursor to the CIA during World War II. And many of his friends in the CIA who would have been very familiar with LSD, in part because CIA officers at the time would have been required to use LSD. I'm pausing for a second because that sounds so wild. The idea there was if the Russians captured a CIA agent, they would have administered LSD as a way to get them to reveal state secrets. So they had to become accustomed to that state of mind so they could resist interrogation. So Al Hubbard had CIA friends who had used LSD. Al Hubbard had an LSD experience, and Al Hubbard thought, again, this could be a very powerful therapeutic medication. And Al Hubbard was a Kentucky high school dropout. He was also a devout Catholic, and he had some ideas about having been given a mission from the Holy Mother herself to spread the word of LSD far and wide. We don't know if he was telling the truth because he seems to have been something of a huckster. And to that point, he was not a police officer. But he's sitting here with Humphrey Osmond, who is well known for having coined the term psychedelic. And Humphrey Osmond also gave mescaline to Aldous Huxley, after which Aldous Huxley wrote The Doors of Perception, and the American band The Doors took their name from that essay. And the story goes that Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley were writing back and forth, and Aldous Huxley, I'm going to paraphrase here, said something like, to make this mundane world sublime, just take a gram of phenerethyme. So Aldous Huxley liked the term phenerethyme to describe psychedelics. And apparently Humphrey wrote back saying, no. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And it means mind manifesting, or maybe mind expanding. It's not really clear what it means to me. But Humphrey Osmond did a great deal of pioneering work, especially around alcohol use disorder. And what's interesting is that initially, Humphrey thought that LSD was mimicking psychosis. It was a psychotomimetic, and that LSD could be useful in helping people stop using alcohol, and that it could produce that so-called rock bottom experience that Bill Wilson would have discussed. But he learned pretty quickly that's not quite what was happening. Here is one of my favorite little bits of evidence from that first wave of research. Now, people think of psychedelics as being associated with maybe a counterculture, and that they would have been fringe and, of course, associated with the hippies and the Woodstock generation at the time. But Al Hubbard, who I mentioned, was a devout Catholic and felt that he was on a mission from God to spread the word of LSD far and wide, was able to convince a Catholic priest in Vancouver to give LSD a try. And this was the Reverend Brown, who, after his experience, decided to write about his experience to his congregation. Again, that sounds really wild to me. I mean, by today's standards, a Reverend Catholic priest had an LSD experience and then wrote a letter to his congregation to describe it. And I'll read the letter because I think it just shows that there was a time where clearly psychedelics were not so politically loaded. They weren't associated with any kind of political movement. They would have been a medication that psychiatry was very interested in at the time. So he wrote, friends, true scientific knowledge is the honorable objective of man's inquisitive intellectual faculties. The scientists have divided into myriad sections the vast, seemingly limitless data that is ours to learn. Over the centuries, man has gained collectively, drawing on his predecessors and sharing with his colleagues and successors. Keep in mind, this was written in 1957. Obviously, the language is not inclusive. Each division of the scientific knowledge has produced proof conclusive of the supreme being responsible for the perfection of order our scientific minds uncover. We are aware of man's fallibility and will be protected in our studies by that understanding and recognition of the first cause of all created things and the laws that govern them. So he sets this up really nicely. I think it's really well written. We therefore approach the study of these psychedelics and their influence in the mind of man, anxious to discover whatever attribute they possess, respectfully evaluating their proper place in the divine economy. We humbly ask our Heavenly Mother, the Virgin Mary, help of all who call upon her to aid us to know and understand the true qualities of these psychedelics, the full capacities of man's noblest faculties, and according to God's laws, to use them for the benefit of mankind here and in eternity. So here's a representative of an Orthodox tradition, the largest organization on the planet, who seems to be endorsing, at least at a minimum, more research with LSD. I think that's important to keep in mind. Obviously, psychedelics have taken on a new character, and a lot of it has to do with how the media has covered them over time. So the question is always, what happened during that first wave? I mean, there was a lot of interest, tremendous interest in the scientific community. From what we can tell, there are more than 1,000 clinical studies that were published with somewhere around 40,000 people who were administered a psychedelic, mostly LSD. And here are just some of my favorite examples. This is LSD in the treatment of criminal psychopaths. Again, not sensitive language, but we've gotten better. Use of LSD in the treatment of alcoholism. Residential psychedelic LSD therapy for the narcotic addict. This was published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, now JAMA Psychiatry, not a fringe journal. And this study is now cited rather widely because it's still to date the only study of a psychedelic in the treatment of opioid use disorder. And the results look quite promising. There's also a publication here in JAMA by Walter Pankey and colleagues, essentially on the use of LSD for end-of-life distress, or what we might think of now as demoralization. I'm emphasizing that these publications were not in fringe journals. These are mainstream, very impactful journals today. And then I'm a psychologist. This is really one of our major journals, Psychological Bulletin, here on the effects of LSD. We also have a very nicely conducted meta-analysis on trials conducted between 1966 and 1970. One thing that's a bit frustrating, if you look at the older literature, you can see that contemporary methodological standards were not at play. These studies are often not very rigorous, so it can be difficult to know exactly what's taking place in these studies. But of those that were conducted well with control conditions and with objective outcomes that are reported, you'll see that there is a odds ratio that favors the LSD intervention over the control. It's around 2. And in some of these studies, notably the SMART et al. Study, there was no psychotherapy provided, no preparation, no discussion of what LSD might even do. From what I can tell in this study, individuals who were admitted to the hospital for alcohol use disorder were essentially tied down to a gurney rolled into a room by themselves and administered a massive dose of LSD. I think it was 800 micrograms. I can't even imagine what that would be like. The best I could say is it's probably similar to what happened to Frodo when he puts the ring on. And yet, even in this circumstance, which is far less than ideal, there was an odds ratio that favored the LSD condition, even though you can see the confidence interval is extremely wide. We saw at the same time use of psychedelics in naturalistic settings and sensationalized media reports of this recreational and naturalistic use. And this is a story I think we have to keep in mind because the media is playing a role today as well. We had Timothy Leary, who was, I think someone most of you have heard of, like a show of hands. Who's heard of Timothy Leary? Sometimes he's vilified because people think, well, he derailed the whole movement or the scientific movement at the time. And I don't know if that's fair, but he was extraordinarily brilliant. He was a professor at Harvard. He came across LSD and he really decided to drop everything he was doing and sort of commit his life, in a sense, to LSD. He was extremely charismatic. He was a wonderful storyteller, and he was also a bit of a trickster. And he would sort of alternate between saying things that seemed to suggest he was encouraging everybody to use LSD, to then saying, no, he never told anybody to use LSD at all. And I think that was just part of his gimmick. He was being a funny guy. But he was known for a popular slogan, which was turn on, tune in, and drop out. And there was this concern that he was encouraging the youth of America to all use LSD. And at one point, Richard Nixon deemed him the most dangerous man in the United States, which seems really silly. But you have to keep in mind at the time, I wasn't there, by the way. I was born in 1976. I'm talking like I know from experience. I don't. But from what I read, what the historians have said, there was this counterculture that was probably much more dramatic to the people at the time than we would think today looking back on it. Like we probably couldn't overstate how disruptive it might have been. And there was this concern that an entire generation would refuse to go to Vietnam, and an entire generation were drastically changing the way they dressed, gender norms were changing, and people were going to move out to communes and sign out of capitalism altogether and just eat brown rice for the rest of their lives out in the woods. And I think that was a very frightening idea in the sense that if everybody stopped buying things today, our society would probably collapse in some ways. So I think Nixon thought we need to put the lid on this drug and file it away in the archives and hope that no one talks about it again. This is an image I borrowed from Jonathan Haidt. Has anyone heard of Jonathan Haidt before? Some of you? So John Haidt was my professor as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. I was so lucky to have him as a professor. He was so influential to me and so inspiring. This is an image that he used in one of his TED Talks, so I have to give him credit for that. This is a Hieronymus Bosch Garden of Earthly Delights. And Haidt describes this as a good way of depicting how political forces work together in a sense as yin and yang. And the idea is this, that obviously any given society needs to progress, we need to change, we need to improve. And the idea is that progressive or liberal forces encourage this sort of thing. But we can't change too quickly. We have to be measured in how we change. And if we change too quickly, the idea is that perhaps things could descend into chaos. And that's what's captured here in this triptych. On the left, things are ordered as they should be. The world is beautiful. The natural order is retained. But in the middle, things get to be a little wild, and they descend into this dystopian sort of Gotham City madness on the far right. And one idea is that those who might identify as conservative would say, we're trying to keep things as they were and as they should be, such that we don't descend into madness. And my sense is that the conservative folks at the time saw with LSD and that counterculture that LSD appeared to be fueling a descent into chaos if something wasn't done and done quickly. But what that does mean is that the scientific or medical justification for the placement of psychedelics in Schedule I, which is the most highly illegal and restrictive category, were not justified. Here are results from two studies that, if you can see, I don't know if the print might be a bit small for you, but essentially ranks different drugs of potential misuse on the horizontal axis by essentially how addictive they might be, and then on the vertical axis by how severe the risk of fatality might be. The dangerous drugs are in the top right quadrant. These are addictive and they carry a high risk of overdose, essentially. So you see that IV heroin is in the top right corner. These studies were conducted before fentanyl existed. I'm sure fentanyl would be close to heroin. Alcohol is there, amphetamines are there, cocaine is there. Those drugs that are in the bottom left quadrant would be those that might be a bit safer. They're not especially addictive and it would be very difficult to overdose. And we see that psilocybin taken orally is there in the very bottom left corner. A frequently asked question I've received is exactly how much psilocybin might you have to ingest to potentially overdose? And that is a fascinating question. It took many years of reading everything I get my hands on until I finally found something that suggested you'd essentially have to eat somewhere around 25 pounds of dried mushrooms to get to that territory. And I mean, to put that in perspective, if you go to a steakhouse where they have like a challenge to see who can eat the largest steak, and you see like a picture of a guy who looks like he plays offensive line, you know, for the Broncos on the wall, he's typically eating like a 3 or 4 pound steak. Okay, so eating 25 pounds of anything would not be possible. So there's no known organic toxicity, though this doesn't mean that psilocybin is without risk. There are certainly risks, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. But the question is, did it make sense to place psychedelics in Schedule 1, which would indicate they're dangerous and addictive and have no medical application? I think the answer is no. Many of you have probably also seen this from a study that David Nutt published in The Lancet years ago, where he essentially had a panel of experts rank the drugs of potential misuse in the UK according to the harm they might pose to users in blue and the harm to others in red. And in their analysis, you see that alcohol ranked number 1. Yet, you know, alcohol is one of the most widely used drugs, certainly in the UK and in the US. At the very bottom of the list was mushrooms with a score of 6 relative to alcohol 72. You'll see that LSD has a score of 7 and ecstasy has a score of 9. Now, David Nutt was commissioned to do this study by a governmental agency, and I think they wanted to know, do our drug laws make sense? In fact, I think they wanted him to show their drug laws made sense. And instead, he produced these findings and said in an interview that horseback riding was more dangerous than MDMA use. And they didn't like that he said that, and they fired him from that position. So we have to keep in mind that things are politicized. We're humans; they're bound to be. And I'm certainly aware of that. I live in Alabama. It's probably a bit more conservative than New Mexico, I would guess. I don't know. So we're now in the midst of what we might call a psychedelic renaissance. I don't think I'm ready to call it that until I see all manner of sites across the nation and the globe doing this work. And I'm really excited that New Mexico will be doing more. I mean, UNM was, of course, a leader in this area of research. We have, of course, the groundbreaking work by Rick Strassman on DMT in the 90s. This, I think, often does not get as much credit as it should, but this really opened a number of doors for those of us to work in this area. And I myself cited this work while preparing FDA documents. So I'm very grateful to the pioneering and incredibly rigorous and brave work of Dr. Strassman in this area. And of course, it was conducted here at the University of New Mexico. So you should all be very proud of your role as a pioneer on the global stage. And then what really seemed to change things is this study by Roland Griffiths, published in Psychopharmacology in 2006. This is on the effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. Now, quick break, autobiographical. People often ask me, how is it that I became interested in psychedelics? Like, there must be a story there. And they often think it's, well, I had been an extensive user of psychedelics prior. And I'm sad to say that's not the case. Kind of a boring person. But the story is, in fact, that my dissertation was published in the very same issue of this journal. And I'll show you here really quickly. So same journal, same year, same issue. I was very excited to see my name in print. Can you read the title all the way through without dozing off? I was really excited to see my name in print. And so I was given a complimentary copy of this issue. It came to my little office as a postdoc at UCSF, and I opened up this journal thinking I'll open to my article and I'll get to see my name in print for the first time and maybe share it with my mom. But I instead opened to this article and thought, no, wait a second. This is crazy. I thought psilocybin was just a hallucinogen. It just makes you hallucinate. I mean, it might be like just taking too much diphenhydramine or something. Like, there's nothing to be said other than it's gonna mess with your your perception and vision. But instead, we have an incredible study here indicating that people have these highly transcendent and meaningful experiences that they claim change the quality of their lives, and that their friends and family members say make them kinder, gentler people, happier people going forward. And this for me was really eye-opening. You know, I should say I'm a DC area native. It's very political. I grew up there in the 80s. You know, my formative years were during the Reagan administration, so maybe peak drug war era, and certainly Nancy had her Just Say No campaign. So I had certainly internalized the idea that psychedelics were just dangerous and addictive, and in fact hadn't really thought much about them. And there's really no education on this topic. In most psychology textbooks, there's maybe a paragraph that would say, and then in the 60s, the late 60s, there was this thing with LSD, which was kind of weird. But anyway, let's move on to other topics. So it was really interesting to learn more about this. And from this point, I decided to really take a deep dive and understand more about psychedelics. And I became very interested in studying them, especially in a therapeutic context, and was very happy to see that in the past, alcohol use disorder was really the leading indication for psychedelic therapy. So I became dead set on doing this line of work, and it took some time, and many people having a good laugh at my expense and asking me if I was the next Timothy Leary or if I had lost my mind, but I finally came around to doing it. And I'll tell you about my study in just a moment. But I want to very briefly talk about some of the research that you may have seen in recent years. So there's been some really wonderful research on demoralization. This was a study conducted by Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Johns Hopkins. You know, Roland was, you probably heard, passed away recently. He had colon cancer himself. He was a friend of mine and really quite the pioneer. And in this study, we saw a really rapid and robust reduction in depression and anxiety among those with advanced stage cancer and essentially end-of-life related demoralization. These results were essentially replicated in a study, a parallel study at NYU. My friend Brian Anderson at UCSF conducted what is still one of my very favorite studies. This was a study of demoralization among gay-identified men who had survived the HIV epidemic in the mid to late 80s. Men who had lost some of their closest friends and partners, and who had this sense that life had kind of lost its meaning or purpose. That's what demoralization is. And we think that precisely what psychedelics might do is bring some sense of meaning or purpose. And in this study, which was a single-arm open-label trial, so interpret with a grain of salt, there was a rather robust reduction in demoralization after psilocybin administration that appeared to be maintained through 3-month follow-up. I would say at a minimum this suggests more research should be conducted. I think many of you should be familiar with this because this study was in part conducted here at the University of New Mexico. How many of you worked on the study? I'm curious before I start to explain to you your own study. So no one. Okay, that's good. I don't know if this has a laser pointer, does it? Yeah, okay. So I can't tell where my laser is. There we are. What you want to look at is that graph there. And essentially what they found in this study was a reduction in heavy alcohol consumption after 2 administrations of psilocybin. Pretty big doses. You'd want to be lying down. You'd want to be wearing eye shades and listening to music in this case. That was maintained through 36 weeks after drug administration. And this was compared to a placebo control that received diphenhydramine. That's Benadryl. It's an antihistamine. So really exciting and notable findings led by Michael Bogenschutz, who was here before he left for New York. We also have some really exciting findings with smoking cessation. To date, Matt Johnson has only published this single-arm open-label trial where 12 out of 15 of the participants quit smoking, which is really quite remarkable because usually the best smoking cessation treatments might result in 20 to 30% abstinence. So 12 out of 15 is 80%. Again, no control condition, so we should be cautious, but there will be more data that will be published soon, and we're on the verge of starting an NIH-funded trial of psilocybin for smoking cessation, and that's being conducted at UAB, Hopkins with Matt Johnson, and at NYU with Michael Bogenschutz. So we're really excited to get that going. If we could improve the nature of our treatments with smoking cessation, I should mention, then we'd have the ability to address what is the most important public health problem in the United States still. 500,000 lives are claimed every year by smoking. And if we can improve our treatments even from, let's say, 20% effectiveness to 50, then we're talking about millions of lives that we can save. And that really gets me excited. There have been some great studies with depression. This is an older study. You've probably seen some of the newer ones. There have been studies of ayahuasca. In fact, this was the first RCT, placebo-controlled RCT, showing a rather rapid and robust effect of ayahuasca on depression. But there have been more recent studies on psilocybin, published in both JAMA Psychiatry, again, rapid and robust effects associated with psilocybin. And then I believe 2 studies in the New England Journal of Medicine. This was the study conducted by the group at Compass, where they tested different doses of psilocybin, where you might think of 1 milligram as their inert placebo. You've probably also seen a study led by Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues where they compared psilocybin to escitalopram, and though they reported essentially no difference between the 2 conditions, in secondary analyses, which they, I guess, did not pre-register, they would indicate that there is, in fact, some evidence that psilocybin outperformed escitalopram in that population or in that sample. Now, I want to say these findings are relevant because a leading theory of addiction would indicate that the primary motive for addictive substance use or for substance use is the escape or avoidance of negative affect. So in other words, when people feel sad or anxious or maybe hopeless, they would turn to a substance as a way of coping with those feelings. It's a maladaptive coping response in that it only works for a little while before you are right back to feeling the way you were. But our brains tend to be oriented toward immediate rewards, right? So addiction is essentially a condition in which you are choosing to do something that works in the short term, even though in the long term it's a bad strategy. So I want to talk now about the trial that we've been conducting. In fact, we've dosed all 40 participants in our study. I'm very excited about that because it took a long time. And 2 of our participants are in long-term follow-up. So we'll have all the data collected soon, and we hope to publish this summer. So we are studying psilocybin-facilitated psychotherapy for cocaine dependence. And one question is, why cocaine? There are a number of reasons for that. One, I'll draw your attention to a meta-analysis my postdoctoral fellow Sarah Lappin and I published a few years ago in addiction. And here we found that of all the substances that are targeted in clinical trials, you'll see the highest rates of dropout associated with major stimulants. Okay, so the rates of dropout with cocaine were 48.7, methamphetamine 53.5. Only one study in that case. And then major stimulants, broadly speaking, 46.8. So the rate of dropout in studies that target major stimulants essentially hovers around 50%. And that's in stark contrast to some of the other substances here that are targeted, including alcohol, which has an average rate of dropout of 26.1%. So it's very challenging to work with individuals who have major stimulant use disorder. Major stimulants just disrupt cognitive behavioral control. It's very difficult to come to appointments with any kind of reliability. In our study, we scan our participants. There's an fMRI component, and just having taken a look at the effect of cocaine on the brain, I have nothing but empathy. I think cocaine is very disruptive to neurological functioning. So it's very difficult to treat the population. We have no pharmacotherapies for major stimulant use disorder, no approved pharmacotherapies, and our best behavioral interventions are generally contingency management, which would mean you pay people to not use. And the problem with these approaches is once you stop paying people, they tend to start using again. And also, politically, it's just not very popular. So if you wanted support from a policymaker for a contingency management program, it's likely not going to happen. And we had this happen when I was in California. We had produced some very nice results some colleagues of mine had around contingency management in migrant farm workers to reduce methamphetamine use disorder, and we showed that it worked. But Arnold's office, it was Governor Arnold at the time, said that they didn't want to pay people to do what they should be doing. And so there's another problem with contingency management. So we don't really have much that works around cocaine use disorder or methamphetamine use disorder. Rates of dropout are high, and there are no pharmacotherapies. Also, in some work that we published back in 2014, in a very large sample, a naturalistic sample of individuals under community correction supervision, we found that those who were using any hallucinogens, right, hallucinogen use disorder in this data set was a proxy for hallucinogen use, were less likely to recidivate in this diversion program, whereas the use of cocaine was the single strongest predictor of recidivism in the sample. So cocaine use is very strongly predicted to recidivism. This is a multiple logistic regression, by the way, controlling for a variety of covariates. It's also very strongly tied to risky sexual behavior and transmission of STIs. And so there's definitely a need to develop something that could work for cocaine use disorder. So let me tell you a bit about the study and what I'm going to present today. So since 2015 or so, I've been conducting this study. And you might wonder why it's taken so long. There are a couple of answers to that question. We funded the study from a discretionary account. It was a shoestring budget. So I was both the PI and the primary therapist. Now, of course, that's not ideal from the perspective of whatever bias I introduced into the study, but this was our financial reality at the time. If we wanted to do the study, I had to be the primary therapist. Everybody dedicated their time free of charge, so no one's effort was covered, including my wonderful physician colleagues. And we had a limited budget with regard to advertising. And we also chose to go about the study in a very deliberate way, recognizing that, well, we're doing a study with psychedelics to treat cocaine use disorder in Alabama, which, you know, has, I think, still the highest net approval rating for Donald Trump. So it's a very conservative state, and we weren't entirely sure how that might be received. It has been received very well, I should say. But at the time, we were worried that this could receive the wrong kind of attention and someone might shut us down. No one did. But we went about this in a very deliberate way. And once we began to feel comfortable and feeling like we were hitting our stride, COVID. And that set us back a bit. And after COVID, we found that people don't really like to come in person for much of anything these days. So it took a little while to finish the study, but we have. I'm going to present results from the first 10 participants who were unblinded at the request of my Data and Safety Monitoring Board. Okay, so the protocol is kind of complicated. I'll just give you a brief overview. So we have what we first call pre-treatment, where we have potential participants come to our lab, first just to show us that they're able to come to appointments. We screen them at this time for hypertension. You know, psilocybin can increase blood pressure by 10 to 15 points, and anybody with untreated hypertension would need to have that addressed or would not participate in the study. They would not screen in the study. And then I generally would ask them questions about their medical or psychological history. They would obviously exclude them from the study. So anybody who, for instance, has a personal family history of bipolar disorder, we would exclude from the study, as there's some indication that psychedelics could bring about a manic episode or maybe even a psychotic episode. So we also would exclude anybody with a family history of schizophrenia. It's a little harder, though, than it seems, because in the Deep South, I learned the term schizophrenia is sometimes just used to describe maybe someone who is irritable. So it would, I know it sounds funny, but sometimes people would say, well, my mom had schizophrenia. And I'd say, well, really, tell me about that. Did she hear voices? Did you see disconnection from reality? No, she just got really irritable with us when we were kids. It's like, oh, so she was a mom. It's we would then have a medical exam, a basic blood panel, EKG, to ensure our participants were generally healthy and could essentially tolerate an increase in heart rate and blood pressure for an hour or two. After we knew they qualified for the study, we began the so-called preparation sessions, which, as they sound, were designed to prepare people for a very intense experience with a drug that profoundly alters consciousness, something that I'm emphasizing here for those of you who are not aware, and is so unlike any experience anybody would have had before that it's almost impossible to truly prepare them for it, because words can't really do justice how intense and different and awe-inspiring and amazing and terrifying the experience can be. So we noted that it was really important that our participants feel very comfortable with us, that we establish therapeutic alliance and rapport, that they understand exactly what they were getting into, and that we had a strategy for dealing with what is essentially inevitable anxiety or panic that often is experienced in the first hour or two. We also provided during this time an empirically supported and manualized cognitive behavioral therapy for cocaine use disorder. I wanted to include that because I felt like if we're giving a placebo, I want to ensure that everybody's getting at least something that we know works, but also I just think it makes for a more robust comparison, that we're not simply comparing psilocybin to diphenhydramine, but psilocybin combined with an empirically supported CBT to diphenhydramine along with an empirically supported CBT. So we want to show that it does something above and beyond something that we already know works. After these preparation sessions, we would administer the drug in a clinical research unit, which is like an outpatient research ward. There are a team of nurses there, a crash cart, a med team, all of which probably not necessary, but made my IRB feel at ease, that we were prepared to address any sort of emergency that might arise. None did, thankfully. Now, I will say that we did scan our participants' brains before and after. I'm not going to present those results today because for those of you who are familiar with fMRI, cleaning and pre-processing those data take a little while. And for this presentation, didn't really want to get into that. But we were interested in default mode network functional connectivity at resting state, as well as GLX, which we assessed through MRS. After drug administration, the so-called integration period begins. I wish we had a better term because that sounds, a little esoteric to me. I think, in essence, people have experiences that often involve insight, and we engage in what I think is best described as natural problem solving, and that's a term that I'm pretty sure derives from the motivational interviewing literature, and we have also Bill Miller at University of New Mexico to thank for that work. So people have insights, and if I had to guess, this is just my observation. People have these experiences in which they see how their behavior is not consistent with their values. This is very much, I think, aligned with motivational interviewing, and afterwards have this desire to change their behavior such that it aligns with their values. And sometimes they would ask us, well, I haven't talked to my brother in years. How do I reinitiate contact? And how do I get back in touch with my family when they've probably heard this story before, that I've changed my ways and that I'm a different person now? And so we'd engage in very basic natural problem solving and continue to provide some CBT and essentially try to make sure that our participants had everything that they needed before sending them back out into the wild, so to speak, knowing that many of them did not have the resources for continued treatment. And even though we tried to link them with treatment, there are very few resources in Alabama, and as you'll see, our participants were economically disadvantaged, and most, if not all, did not have insurance. Now, after the end of treatment, we did assessments only at 90 days and 180 days. So in essence, we provide the drug, there's a month more of treatment, and then we have assessments that take place 3 months and 6 months after the end of treatment, which means 4 and 7 months after we've administered the drug. A little bit about the demographics of our participants. So most were men, the majority were African American. The city of Birmingham is approximately 75% African American. So our sample generally represents the demographics of the city. Half had a high school degree or less. There were some homeless participants. So you can see half made less than $10,000 per year. Half were unemployed, and they were in their mid-40s. I will say that their lives were challenging and chaotic and difficult. So we administer first the challenging experience questionnaire. After the end of the session, they've sort of come back to this normal state of consciousness. It never ceased to amuse me that after that experience, we'd say, and here's some questionnaires for you. Like, you just had this transcendent experience where you realized all is one, and why don't we try rating that experience on this questionnaire? So we would administer the challenging experience questionnaire, which captures some of the more difficult characteristics of a psychedelic experience, and those are definitely there. I happen to think that these ratings don't fully capture how challenging the experience can be, in part because sometimes people feel a sense of challenge, but maybe only for 20 or 30 minutes, after which they feel awe and wonder and amazement and bliss. And after hours of awe, wonder, amazement, and bliss, those 30 minutes of panic that you felt early on are easy to kind of dismiss, like, yeah, it wasn't a big deal. But I think in the moment, they would have felt quite different. And I often say that the experience is very similar to the first time I took my daughter, now 12, on her first roller coaster. And she must have been 10 at the time. And she told me, Daddy, I'm really excited to get on that roller coaster. I'm brave. I know I can do this. And we were waiting in line, and she was just talking my ear off about how excited she was to finally get on that roller coaster and show me how brave she was. We got on the roller coaster, and she was still happy and talking about how excited she was. And when we started climbing that first hill, she said, okay, Daddy, tell him to stop the ride and take it back. I don't want to do this. This was a mistake. I don't want to do it. 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 And I said, at this point, all we can do is ride it all the way until the end, and that's when we get to get off. And I, funny enough, have used that analogy with my participants. This has begun. You're feeling a sense of panic. The only way off the ride is to see it all the way through. Of course, what followed after for my daughter was a lot of laughter and happiness and smiling. At the end, she said, I had a great time. Let's do it again. Like, you were pretty scared there at the beginning, weren't you? No, it wasn't a problem. So I think in many ways, these ratings could kind of reflect some bias. And I would guess that people, if they really thought about it, would probably give us stronger ratings. But to give you some sense of what these ratings capture, there are adjectival anchors associated with each number. Okay, a rating of 0 would be none. A rating of 1 would be so slight I cannot tell. A rating of 2 would be mild. 3 would be moderate. 4 would be very strong, and 5 is extreme. Okay, so even with the scale where there seem to be the largest differences between conditions, this is with fear, the participants were telling us that their experience of fear was somewhere between so slight I cannot tell and mild. That doesn't really comport with my experience, so I think there are some limitations in self-report. I am intentionally not doing any inferential statistics here, by the way, and I can explain why later if you're interested, but it's sort of like a rigor and reproducibility in science thing. I'd rather not do any analyses until I'm really at the end of the study. Okay, we also administer the mystical experience questionnaire. The same adjectival anchors are used in this scale. So 0 is none, 1 is so slight I cannot tell, 2 is mild, 3 is moderate, 4 is very strong, and 5 is extreme. And on this scale, you can see absolutely the conditions appear to be different, especially around positive mood, where the folks who received psilocybin would say that the experience was, maybe somewhere between very strong and extreme when it comes to feelings of bliss and awe and wonder. These questionnaires, I would also say, they were designed by Harvard scientists in the 60s who had PhDs in comparative religions. And they wrote it, I guess, for their friends who may have also had PhDs in comparative religions. And I'm administering it to many people who dropped out of school in 7th grade. Right? So there's a big issue, too, with literacy in these questionnaires. And there's a limitation. I'm not really sure how much we can make of these responses, but there seems to be something happening here. Okay. We use the same questions that the folks at Johns Hopkins have used. We ask folks, how spiritually significant was your experience? Of the 6 people in the study, and the first 10 who received psilocybin, half said it was the single most spiritually significant experience of their lives. And the next response is it's in the top 5. One said it was in the top 5. Nobody in the placebo condition provided either one of those responses. Again, there's some indication that something's at play here. Okay, here are our findings. Now follow me here. So at baseline, this is percentage of abstinent days. We would like to see this increase. So at baseline, the 2 conditions are using, on average, about half the time. On average, every other day. The only limitation often being whether they have the money to obtain the drug. But there are other forms of currency, and people often exchange sex for drugs as well. But for many people, the only limiting factor was whether they had some form of currency they could exchange for the drug or whether they could find it. During the preparation process, you'll see that abstinence increased. This is a good thing, and you see this in clinical trials. People begin to change their behavior, sometimes even before you've provided any treatment, because they're in a clinical trial and they're motivated and ready to change. But during the period of time that we are providing an empirically supported treatment, people began to change their behavior. We see a nice increase in abstinence. Now, during the so-called integration process, this is after we've administered the drug, until the last treatment session, we see that those who received psilocybin reported 100% abstinence. Those in the placebo condition did not. At 90-day follow-up, both conditions, you see a dip in abstinence. I can kind of share a little bit about that in a bit. Only for that to return to 100% abstinence at day 180 follow-up among those who received psilocybin, and also a nice increase in abstinence among those who received the placebo. So a couple of things I note about this. When you conduct a clinical trial, you inherently recruit people who are very highly motivated. Okay, so we had very highly motivated participants. Also, when you do a study with a psychedelic, at least to date, you usually provide a very intensive treatment with or without the drug, whether it's the psilocybin or the placebo. So everybody received a rather intensive treatment. So it's good to see that generally people are doing quite well, even those who received the placebo. But it does appear that those who received the active drug, the psilocybin, are doing a bit better. Now, maybe you want to know what it's like for those who participated, and I have an anecdote that one of my participants shared. There's a reason I have this image, because this was his experience in part. This participant was an ordained, still is an ordained minister, so he's a Christian and very religious. And early on, he asked 2 or 3 times if he could go home. And he was very calm and asking, but I could tell he was panicking a bit. We kind of joked afterwards that his experience in some ways was like the famous Mike Tyson quotation, which is, I mean, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Have you heard that one before? So he felt very confident, and then psilocybin punched him in the mouth. And he was scared. He wanted to go home, but we were able to reassure him to dive into the experience, and he ended up having a very beneficial experience. And here are his exact words that I'll read. When we asked him what his experience was like, he said, "A lot of stuff I can't even put into words. The most meaningful stuff was confronting demons. I felt like I saw Satan. I was so out of control, I wanted to go home. When I lied back down, I made up my mind that it was okay to die. That was surrendering. I asked Satan to let me go from my addictions. Right when I said that, out of the dark, a light came in. A lot of it had to do with the music changing, but one song came on, light came in, and God rescued me. I felt a glorious feeling out of the fear. Out of that fear, I started feeling like I was rescued. Now he's saying this essentially the day after. Now just the thought of cocaine terrifies me. The thought of using terrifies me because I asked Satan to release me. It feels like it's been a year. Today I was thinking about using, but if I did, everything would be lost because God is turning everything around. God told me if I stopped using cocaine, he would pour his blessings out, and I believe that. I feel like I'm a different person. The guy you saw last week, I may look the same, but I am not the same. I went from evil to good to triumph to crying to repentance. This was an encounter with something far beyond." Now, that's just one of many. There are many others that are similar. Now, I want to say a little bit about what we think might be going on here. We have a theoretical mechanism of action here. In essence, what we think might be at play is with many psychological conditions, including substance use disorder, you see a rather pathological self-focus, like a myopic tunnel or laser vision. In the case of those who are using substances, in the case of those who are using substances, there's this fixation on relieving the urge, obtaining the drug, using the drug, finding the money to obtain the drug, and one's experience can begin to resemble that of someone who's just looking through a straw, in a sense, in reality. Their field of vision is very limited. And there's a video here where I'll attempt to show this. We think that with psychedelics, one's attentional scope is broadened in a very real way, both from a perceptual perspective and a cognitive perspective. And in that broadening of attention, that self-focus is reduced dramatically, such that people feel somewhat liberated from that self-focus, but also are able to make some novel insights or connections that they hadn't before when they were so self-focused and experiencing reality as though walking around with a straw. So we've come up with a kind of a silly video that captures this in part, but maybe you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm working on this a little bit, but early on we were focused just on this child who's here looking at a fly. This is Salvador Dali, hallucinogenic toreador, aptly named. Funny enough, owned by where I went to graduate school at the University of South Florida. So as a graduate student, I could go and see Dali's masterpieces whenever I wanted. So this has meaning to me too. The idea is for those who are dealing with substance use disorders and likely other mental health conditions, your attentional focus becomes extremely myopic and limited to a very small field of vision. And during a psychedelic experience, it's broadened in a way that you would not have been able to anticipate. In the case of maybe somebody who only experiences painting from this corner. And it's in that moment that you forget all about yourself. That's where this notion of ego dissolution comes from. But the thing is, it's not just that you've forgotten you exist or that you don't exist. You're also very present to an experience, very much present to an experience that has nothing to do with you or very little to do with you. And that's when insights can come into play. If it was just ego dissolution, then you could drink like a gallon of vodka and yeah, your ego would dissolve, but you wouldn't be present to the experience and it wouldn't do you any good. My graduate student, Haley Duran, and I published a paper, which, Larry told me he read, and I appreciate that. You're brave, it's very long, but if you're interested, this was published in Pharmacologic Reviews, and we talk a bit about this, and we do say that, look, it does make sense that in part psychedelics were once thought to be psychotomimetics, because psychosis is characterized by entropic processing, right? So hyper-associative processing. You make connections where others may not. But the difference between psychedelics and psychosis is that with psychedelics, self-focus is reduced, right? So you're having hyper-associative processing or a broad attentional scope around notions that do not have to do with you, and that seems to be very helpful. But in the case of psychosis, you are very self-focused such that many of these novel ideas have to do with you, and that manifests as paranoid delusions, for example. I think we have a little bit more time. I'm not sure. I'll go quickly. Yeah? Okay. Well, so I mentioned a little bit about the media attention, and this is something that concerns me a little bit. You've probably seen, this is a hype cycle, and I don't know really where we are with psychedelics. It probably depends on the person, the region, but I am often concerned that we might be in something of a hype cycle right now and that our expectations are inflated. And that's because the media coverage, from my perspective, has been uncritically positive. It probably doesn't really frame the findings appropriately. Gives people the impression that psychedelics are magical cures and would work for everybody and that don't carry substantial risk. I think that the inflated expectations are in part why there are these initiatives to legalize state by state. I don't really have a problem with that. I think people should be free to do whatever they want with their bodies, obviously, and this is the democratic process in action, but I am concerned still about the adverse events that are bound to happen, especially if the public has not been well informed as to precisely how psychedelics work and the sort of risk that they do carry. So I think we're going to have to see how things proceed, but it's possible that if and when we hear some of the adverse events that you may have heard about recently, there was a pilot who tried to down a commercial airliner. Have you heard of this story? Yeah, most of you. So I guess the story was he wasn't flying the plane, but he had a psychedelic experience recently that unsettled him, kind of turned his emotional life upside down. And he was flying in the cockpit, and he was sort of disassociated, it seems, and tried to cut off fuel supply to the engines, which would have led to a downing of this plane. Fortunately, that was averted. But afterwards, he said that he had tried to treat himself with psilocybin, and that he was just really all out of sorts. And I think this is a plausible explanation, because psychedelics are so powerful. I think without the proper preparation and support afterwards, people might really be in bad shape after their experience. And we saw in the Compass trials that there were, I think, 3 people who engaged in suicidal behavior after their experience. And I think that's because these experiences can dredge up some really difficult emotional material that can be hard to wrap your mind around. And it can be really helpful to be prepared for that and have someone who can help you with that. And so the question is, what happens when the coverage has been nothing but positive and we see more and more stories about people who've really been disturbed, at least in the short term, from their experience and begin to do things that could harm others? There was another story about a veteran who had shot somebody while he was tripping on mushrooms. It didn't quite make the headlines. I'm not sure why, but I think there'll be more such stories. And my question is, will the media turn back to the scientists and say, well, wait a second, you guys said that this would be sort of the next big thing in psychiatry? And all I can say is I think there's a really big difference between the use of psychedelics in very carefully controlled medical settings where we've carefully selected our participants and prepared them and erected all these safeguards, and use in naturalistic settings where none of these things exist. And just to be clear, I'm not making any statements about anyone's liberty to do what they want with their consciousness, but I still think we have to be concerned about how the media and the public and policymakers will react to these headlines. Here's one such example. Art Linkletter. Anybody know who that is? Oh, good, one. I think he hosted Kids Say the Darndest Things, isn't that right? So he was a media personality, and very tragically, his daughter, Diane, committed suicide, and she jumped out of her apartment window in Hollywood. And he felt very strongly that suicide was connected to her use of LSD, and he may have been right. According to Art Linkletter, his daughter had said that she had tried LSD because she had heard about Timothy Leary and his encouraging youth to do so, but it was very unsettling and upsetting. And shortly after her LSD experience, she committed suicide. And Art was convinced that LSD and Timothy Leary was to blame, and he really dedicated the rest of his life as something of a drug warrior and a crusader, someone who would warn of the dangers of LSD. And again, he may have been right. It may be that his daughter did commit suicide as a result of sort of an LSD experience that she didn't really prepare for, or that she could have used some support for. And I think this is one reason why so many people to this day think, oh, you take a psychedelic and you might attempt to kill yourself. It's in part because of some of the work that Art did and what happened to his daughter. There's also the story of Frank Olson. If anybody see Wormwood, the documentary Wormwood, that Hamilton Morris's father produced. Okay, and this was about a CIA agent who was claimed to have killed himself after having used LSD as required, I guess, by the government at the time. It's unclear if he did. It may be that he was thrown from the window himself. But these anecdotes, they reach the public eye, and it really alters the way that we think about these substances. So we have to think about what might happen when these stories continue to make headlines, and how that's going to impact the opinions of our politicians, who often rely on these sort of headlines to steer their decisions. What else? So a couple of things I would just say. It's something that I like to always say. I think for those of us interested in this line of work, we should be really transparent from the very beginning about the potential benefits and the risks. So, for example, with smoking cessation, current success rates, like I said, are 20 to 30%. If we double that rate, that would be a boon for public health. It would be huge. It would be wonderful. But that would still mean that the treatment may not be effective for 40 to 60% of smokers. So if we started a smoking cessation clinic here in Albuquerque, and 100 people went through this treatment, maybe 60 are still smoking, and they say, well, wait a second, Dr. Lehman, I thought Michael Pollan said that would change my mind. I'm still smoking. And I think we need to communicate now about what we expect. We think that our treatments will improve, but they certainly won't work for everybody, and psychedelics won't be for everybody either. We should also be very clear about the risks. And it's probably important to note that there's not a thing that we ever do that doesn't carry risk. I think I read that something like 100 to 200 Americans die of heart attacks in gymnasiums and gym floors every year. People who are working out and doing something healthy will die of heart attacks. Okay, this is something that we generally all should be doing for the most part. So it's not as though there are not going to be risks with psilocybin. I think if somebody who had a pretty serious underlying heart issue has a high dose psilocybin experience, it's possible they have a cardiac event. I think also there are concerns around panic reactions, people fleeing administration rooms, and then people just feeling unsettled afterwards and potentially engaging in self-harm, and maybe even manic episodes or psychotic episodes that could follow. So I think we should be really clear that these are not drugs that don't carry risk, but everything carries risks. Second to last slide here, I'd also just like to encourage, especially the clinicians here in the room, to start thinking about having discussions with managed care now, because we're already noting this is likely to be a very costly and intensive treatment, and we have to think about how we're going to partner, or managed care will partner with practices. And without a viable business model, classic psychedelics just won't be taken up. And it certainly would drive me crazy personally if, after all this work, the only people who have access to a psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy would be those who could pay out of pocket, and not the people who were participants in my study. With that, I'm in Albuquerque, so I had to throw this in. Happy to take some questions.